Heads up, female leaders, executives, and entrepreneurs. We have just opened enrollment for our next Renegade Accelerator. You can head to renegadeaccelerator.com to check out all of the information and apply.
I was on the road 250 days a year, which for 14 years, between 150 and 250 days a year. And it was kind of like, you know, that analogy with frogs where they say like, oh, you just like 1 degree warmer. And then before you know it, the frog is like boiling. That summed up my professional life.
I'm Amy Jo Martin. Welcome to the Why Not Now show. You know that thing you've been thinking about doing? Yeah, that one. Why not now? Have you ever actually taken the time to ask yourself, what's stopping me? Let's talk it through. This is your chance to give that idea the attention it deserves and take action. Each episode, I have a chat with a fascinating person, from entrepreneurs to athletes, celebrities, my parents, rocket scientists, and all walks of life. We talk through a critical time when they've asked themselves, why not now? We dissect that day or even that moment, step by step.
Today's guest has completely reinvented her life. Alexis Jones is on the podcast today, and if you read her bio or look at her LinkedIn, you will know she's an internationally recognized speaker. She's an author, a media personality. She's built companies. She's done all of these things. But what she has done recently over the last couple of years is really the biggest accolade, I would say, that a person could have. And that's being extremely brave to completely rebuild and reinvent. That's what she's done. So Alexis tells us today how she's navigated that, how she went from an experiment to iterating to a little more bravery, a little more, and making the ultimate experience of moving across the country, moving from Austin, Texas to Montana, and pretty much starting a whole new life possible. So she is the author of Joy Hunter, which is a great title for her because that's exactly what she's been doing. And she believes joy is the gatekeeper to resilience, inspiration, health, and innovation. And she also believes that adventure is oxygen to our soul. So here is a person who was wired one way and kind of did a 180. She also is a new mom, and the journey to motherhood was not an easy one, and quite the story there as well. So I'll let her share her story. And without further ado, here is a lively conversation with Lex Jones and myself talking about anything and everything that has to do with joy hunting. Alexis, welcome to the Why Not Now show. I am so excited to finally connect with you. And in the spirit of Why Not Now, can you tell me about a time when you had a big decision to make and you had to ask yourself, why not now?
Absolutely. Growing up in Austin, and especially with my husband, who's also a fellow Austinite, there came this moment where I was really excited and passionate about moving to Montana, which was absolutely absurd, made no logical sense. We had done this RV trip and I'd kind of fallen in love with the mountains. And by the time we'd gotten back, I told my husband as we were building our dream house, I was like, can we hit pause on that? And can we actually move a couple states over where we basically don't know anyone? And that was probably one of the bravest decisions I ever made. And the night before the U-Haul showed up, I woke up in a dead sweat, panic, and was like, is this the worst idea ever? What are we doing? Are we blowing our lives up? And now 3 years later, I look back and I'm like, that is the most courage I ever mustered up to do something that didn't necessarily logically or like make sense from a cerebral standpoint, but absolutely made sense like in the cells of my body. And it felt like the first time I ever like reconnected to my intuition and actually trusted her.
I love this. Okay, so let's talk about that specific moment. So you had visited prior during this RV extravaganza, which we'll get to. That's a whole nother probably why not now story. What was the moment? What happened? What were you feeling and what triggered the conversation mid dream house architecture?
Yeah, I'd actually been hired by Montana State. So I'd been to Montana once or twice. It was always during the winter, which I felt like people were crazy to live in Montana in, minus 40 degrees. But we'd come back on an RV trip during COVID. And yeah, there was something that, to this day, the best way I could describe it at the time was when my husband said, like, what do you mean? Like move to, like, it wasn't for a job, like, because we didn't have this kind of like tangible excuse of like, well, I got this great job offer, so we're moving. And both of our families live in Austin. We were trying to have kids. So the idea that we had like 5 grandparents within 10 minutes. So people thought we were even more crazy. But at the time, the only way I could describe it to him is I said, being in that mountain town, surrounded by that beauty, it brings me actual joy. That was the only thing like that I could put language to it. And being someone who was so career oriented and so logical and was always kind of like life was a chess game to me. And I always felt like I was like 10 moves ahead at all times. And for the first time, I was like, I don't know. It just feels right. And that felt like language I never used. I was always like, well, I think this and I think that. But for the first time, I said, it just feels right. And so it was a really kind of scary, looking back, like a really kind of scary decision, because I was asking my husband, who had a great job in Austin, again, being like hometown kids. It felt like a huge leap of faith to move to an entirely different place, to ask him to consider, getting a completely different job. But yeah, for the first time, I think that it was just like, I don't know, I just like, there's this like hint or whisper, like something internal that was making decisions for the first time in my life, when I feel like all my decision making had always come from a very external standpoint.
I have so many thoughts because I can imagine your identity being anchored in Texas, both of you. And then I always think, like, when people are making big changes, are they running from something or are they running to something? And it sounds like you were being pulled, like you were running to Montana. And as small town girl from Wyoming, spent a lot of time in Montana, and that's just my area of the US. I get it. I totally get it. But with that being said, after arriving and making that step, did you uncover other potential reasons like, oh, I didn't realize this was also kind of fueling me? Or, you know how hindsight is 2020, but you get there and you're like, oh, well, here are the answers I didn't have.
Yeah. I think that there was just this incredible tribe of women that was also a compulsion, that I'd met several of them when we came on the RV trip. So that community, I think the community had always been important to me. I'd like built organizations based on the principle that like we as human beings require community for not only health and wellness and spiritual well-being, but like it is what fills our cup. So I was someone who like firmly believed in the power of community, but because of my work schedule prior to COVID, I'd never been so lonely in my entire life, because I was spending more days on the road than I was home with my family, much less my friends. So I think that was one thing of kind of, for the first time, maybe sitting in like a stillness, because I was someone who's been on the road. And I know you get this because as a speaker and you're traveling all the time, and like the velocity by which I was operating was not conducive to any of the principles I was like on stage preaching about. So there was definitely kind of this fraudulency of like, I'm out here in the world talking about how important it is to have community and health and wellness. And I wasn't practicing any of those things in my own life. And so our therapist at the time, she made an incredible, like this one-liner that just like ricocheted inside of my body. And she said, you can't heal in the same place you got sick. And I think for Brad and me both, growing up in Austin, growing up in Westlake, growing up in a bit of a fishbowl, and then marrying each other. So then there was like another layer of pressure and expectation that all of a sudden we came to Bozeman, Montana, and it felt like we were getting to like start over in a way that we could be whoever we wanted to be. And we weren't attached to like maybe the expectations others and especially we had placed on ourselves. And so I don't even think again at the time that I could articulate what exactly it was about Bozeman, other than I was like, the mountains, this is 4 seasons, like the spectacular majesty of beauty that consistently put me in a state of awe. And I think that was a feeling that maybe I was longing for. That was one component. The other component was this incredible community that I didn't even know I was like hungry for. And then the other piece I think was it was a different frequency. It was a smaller town. It was a slower pace. And I think that like my spirit was like existentially exhausted at that point. And I needed a little reprieve. And Bozeman felt like, honestly, it felt like Austin in the 80s. Like it felt like what we grew up with, because growing up, Westlake felt like a little town. Everyone knew everyone. You went into the grocery store, you recognized everyone. And that is not the same Austin today. And Bozeman felt like that, like really like safe and you know everybody in small town. And I think I didn't even realize how much I thrived in that environment.
Seeing is believing, I believe. So I'm so grateful that you're telling your story, because we tend to look around and, you know, think things aren't impossible, but they absolutely are. It's just a matter of the choices and the mindset we choose. And I can so relate with just that desire to be in a different environment. I think it's easier to reinvent when you're physically in a different, like, physical space. And after my first company, I went and lived on our boat, literally. And people thought I was pretty crazy, but that's always been the case. And then Richard and I moved to South Dakota on acreage. We'd see more animals in a day than people, and we loved it, you know. And it was just time. So I think someone once said, well, not everybody can just do that. And I said, well, actually, do you want to talk about this? Because you actually can, you just may choose not to, right? And so I think that's where, like, for people to see you make that shift, especially when it's pretty unexpected or is awesome, and then to talk about it. I would love to take a couple steps back, and if you were to give the, you know, movie trailer 5 minutes or whatever of your life and your journey, okay, what would you say? Here's your chance.
Oh gosh. Well, I grew up in Westlake in Austin.
Yep. Good starting place.
I grew up, I always joke that I say that I grew up on the other side of the tracks in Cuernavaca, when Cuernavaca was not cool. I had a chip on my shoulder because I grew up in a very affluent neighborhood. Only we were not affluent. And so I think for me, it was proximity, right? Is always like the gateway to experiencing things. And so I saw that, you know, there was this level of success and wealth and like all of the ways that the world describes success. And so I got really, really hungry for that. And so I did my undergrad and master's at USC, started a company right out of grad school, and was just kind of on this like uphill trajectory of chasing all the things that the world says matters and like checking all the boxes. And at a certain point, I was on the road 250 days a year, which for 14 years, between 150 and 250 days a year. And it was kind of like, you know, that analogy with frogs where they say like, oh, you just like 1 degree warmer. And then before you know it, the frog is like boiling. That summed up my professional life. That it was just like one more speaking engagement, one more travel date, one more.
If I could just get through,
Absolutely. And by the way, I think there's something to say that like I was and am deeply passionate about my work. So it felt so meaningful, in addition to that little girl who grew up, feeling like she didn't have enough. And, was like the poor kid in a rich community. All of a sudden I had this identity as far as like how much money I was making. And like, that felt like it was solving this kind of wound that I had as a kiddo of not feeling enough. And so like, it felt good to my ego, and it felt like I was doing meaningful work, and all the invitations always felt so not prestigious, but like, I was always so humbled by the invitation that I was like, how do you say no? And like, how do you say no to the White House or to like going over to Oprah's house? Like, there was part of me that just had to pinch myself, that I was like, this is my life. So I think there was a genuine, like deep, radical gratitude. And so I just kept saying yes. And that was my pattern. I just kept saying yes to more and more and more. And I think like a lot of people, I reached this level of exhaustion and fatigue, and where I kind of lost my why. Like, I didn't know why I was doing it anymore. And I felt robotic in it. And I was so good at kind of presenting this like curated facade, especially on social media, that everyone was like, oh my God, #blessed. Like, you live this amazing life. And so that like chasm between my real life and the life that was being presented to the world was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because the reality was like kind of behind the velvet curtain. I was having like severe back and neck pain that we couldn't figure out. I wasn't sleeping well. I was overworked. Like, all of these things were taking like a major toll on my physical body, certainly on my relationships, on my relationship with my husband, who I barely saw. We were having a really hard time getting pregnant, which, looking back, I'm like, oh, how crazy. We're having a hard time getting pregnant because I was never home, like flying my husband into airports to like have sex with me because, I was ovulating, and then being like, on to the next thing. I look back at all of that now and I'm like, what? Like, how was I ever functioning in that environment? And so, it was kind of like, I get to the top of the summit, and I pretty much like nosedived off when we finally got pregnant and we lost the baby and COVID hit. So, I had 150 events on the calendar for 2020. Every single event was canceled, which also meant that my entire income went to zero and I went on unemployment. So that was a huge hit to my ego and to my insecurity, right? All of a sudden I was like back to being the girl with like, wait, how am I going to make money? I mean, and these are real like logistical things of like, that's my entire career. I have no income. I am, dashed hopes and dreams of becoming a mom. And then I also found out my dad wasn't my biological father on ancestry.com. So it was just kind of like, and I like how I just casually slide that one in. But it was just kind of like, for people listening, it's like when every single thing that could possibly go wrong in your life all goes wrong all at the same time. That was like the official invitation for me to do the real work that I'd probably been avoiding my whole life, of like the deeply internal, unseen work around feeling like I was enough as a human being, just for breathing, just for existing. And I'd been someone who had, propped myself up on this very performance-based love. Like, if I do enough things and I'm shiny enough and impressive enough and I'm extraordinary, like then I will be loved and seen. And so that was kind of the intro into everything falling apart. That's the gist.
Well, and I want to, let's keep going, because I think having had a similar experience, it doesn't just shift and then it is a daily practice, right? So I want to hear some of the reality of the maintenance of this life too. But so then you did, so during COVID, you went on this adventure, right? And what was the spark of that in terms of, do you remember that moment? I remember the moment where I said to my husband, I've got an idea. And he's like, oh gosh, here it comes. And he knows what's happening. And what if we get an RV? And we did and we ended up doing it, not the same exact, but was there a moment where, okay, we're looking online for an RV?
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, it almost felt like an eject button. I was like, I just need to get out of this life. So what does that look like? And at the same time, our best friend was also going through a big heartbreak for his own reasons. And he casually threw out, like, let's just go. Like, I have, a job opportunity, some consulting. Like, I need to go to Montana. What if we do a road trip out to Montana? It was early COVID. So it was like shelter in place. We didn't even know if we could cross over like one state line, much less like 7 state lines. But at the time, it just felt like, get me the hell out of here. Like, anywhere is better than here. I definitely don't think I realized at the time that I was like going to go on this like life-changing RV trip that I would like write a book about. And it would be the beginning of like all of my life's healing. And like, definitely not. I was just like, get me the hell out of Texas right now. So that was the initial trip. And then of all the different places that we went to, when we pit stopped in Bozeman, Montana, that was where I was like, oh, this feels like home. Like, and again, in a way that was really hard to articulate, much less justify. But before we even got the RV back to Texas, I had already convinced Brad and our best friend, Nick, who I refer to as Luke in the book. But I had convinced both of them, and you get this. It was June. It was already 100 degrees in Texas. It was an easy sell to be like, hey, what if we it's COVID anyway, like we're all working from home. What if we go to Montana and I rent us an Airbnb for 1 month, for like the month of June? And they were like, okay, yeah, sounds good. And then 1 month turned into 11 months. And every month we just kept saying yes. We just kept saying one more month. And I think that's important, because for me, to your point, I don't think it's just like, oh, and then I made a decision to blow up my life and move to Montana. Like, the transition was actually about 2 years of like every month having to renegotiate with my husband, who after 11 months, he like kind of cracked a joke. He was like, did you move to Montana? Is that an option in marriage? And so every month it was like a renegotiation of like, I still want to be here. I still want to be here. I still want to be here. And meanwhile, Brad is working 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So he's kind of accommodating what felt like maybe at the time, like a third life crisis for his wife. He was like, I don't know, she just loves Montana. So, I'm trying to make it work. And then we actually ended up, after 11 months, renting a house for a year. So then we did a year of that, which was still very like, we're not like really moving here. We're just like, Lex is having a moment, and to be really candid, it was very hard on my marriage, because I feel like no one had ever really sat us down and been like, what happens in a partnership when one person wants to move somewhere and like the other person doesn't? Like, who is the tiebreaker in marriage? And so Brad and I had a lot of really hard conversations. When he was playing professional basketball, our understanding, our agreement, because I was living in Europe with him while he was finishing up the last few seasons of his career. And our agreement was, I'm making these sacrifices to live in Europe with him, and took a lot of hits professionally and financially to make that work, that he would move wherever I wanted as soon as he retired. And looking back, and again, I talk about this in the book really candidly, but looking back, when he retired, he was like, okay, now we'll go back to Austin. Our hometown made a lot of sense. Like, again, logically making decisions with my mind all day made so much sense for us to move back home, but it didn't feel right in my body. And yet I completely agreed. And looking back, I had a lot of resentment about moving back to Austin when I wasn't ready to move back to Austin. And so this came at a moment where, I lovingly reminded him of that experience and took responsibility for like how I showed up in that experience, and said, you know what, the truth is, I agreed to move back to Austin because I just loved you so much. And I just couldn't believe that like you loved me. And like, I didn't want to disrupt that. But this was kind of the first time I was like standing up for myself and what I wanted, and was asking him and inviting him to support that. So I think for 2 years, he was kind of like, oh, okay, I'm kind of like paying her back. I think, and I don't want to speak for him, But at the time, I think he was like, I owe her this because, I kind of like, quid pro quo, maybe. So for like 2 years, he was like, okay, like I'll do this because like you lived in Europe with me and that wasn't necessarily your first choice. But by the end of it, and like I said, I think it's important to be really candid about how tough it was on our marriage, because there were moments where he was like, I don't want to live in Montana. Like I never signed up for that. Like we're Austin kids. The game plan was always to move back to Austin. And my challenge to him was like, yeah, but what if that game plan changes? And like, what would it look like to author something that is pretty radical, like pretty rebellious, And I think the other component about making these kind of brave choices to do what feels right for you is we actually ended up having a lot of resistance from like people who loved us and were really close to us. And I think it was very much out of their thoughts of protection of like, what are you doing? Like Brad has this like very, successful, lucrative, stable career in Austin. Like that doesn't translate to Montana. Like you don't have any support system. Like our family was like, I'm like, what kind of euphemism can I use for like not supportive? They were not supportive. Like neither of our moms were like fans of this idea. And so that was scary, which was also just like facing the resistance of people that we really loved and trusted. And yeah, so I think that for those first 11 months, it was every month negotiating, like one more month. Then we did like 1 year in a rental. And then on the other side of that, it was kind of crazy how things unfolded. We had actually agreed to move back to Austin because Brad hadn't really been able to figure out how to translate his career in Montana. So I finally was like, okay, thanks for like 2 epic years. I'm living the dream. I guess we'll head back to Austin again, because like that makes sense. And then out of nowhere, Brad gets offered this dream job and we put an offer in for a house and I get pregnant all within like 2 weeks. So I was like, like Montana unlocked something for us. But I think a lot of people think that like, oh, Brad just got this dream job out of nowhere. But the truth is like we sat in discomfort and the unknown. It was really hard. I mean, it was really hard for like 2 years. We were like in limbo. And again, I think it's easy to be like, and then we decided to move to Montana, and it was like, no, we actually sat in like a lot of discomfort for 2 full years before that decision was solidified.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Hi, everyone. If you are digging this podcast, please do us a favor and subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. It just takes a moment and it means a ton to us.
What I love is this started as an experiment, right? And that's where everything, a lot of things in life are reversible or changeable or, right, we're making these choices. But even the psychological safety of we're going to go on a road trip during a global pandemic that we've never been in before. So, here we are. It's an experiment. What's the worst thing that can happen? But then that experiment growing, and it's almost like you think of a petri dish where you're just, am I going to water this? Are we done? And I like to just think of it as, can we get to a red, yellow, or green light as quickly as possible and decide the very next best step? But that one more month, I think what you mentioned about the being in limbo is a lot of people cannot live in limbo very long, right? So, and I know this because I'm kind of the contrast, but even people who are very wealthy, but they bounce between different houses and they travel, they do not, after a while, I keep hearing I really want to be grounded and have my routine or whatever. And so that's pretty amazing where you were okay with the unknown for that length of time. And every month, it's almost like rent's due. Are we going to pay or not? But you knew it was coming.
That was, like 2-3 days before the end of every month.
Yeah.
You're doing the Airbnb. She was like, do you want it for another month? And every,
and people are asking, right, can we plan this in September and you're like, I don't know if we're going to be here. Can we do that? I don't know, Mom. I don't know where I'll be. And it's just, so that's kind of, I think that's one of the kickers, is that you are able to be okay with that unknown and live in that uncomfort, because the expansion in your literal genetic code of just stretching yourselves in that stressful situation unlocks more potential, and like, oh, well, it's really not that bad. Or so I think that's amazing. And then I think too, what you said about that makes sense. Okay, we're going to do that because that makes sense. And we, of course, that's our default. Like that's the direction then, right? But what I want to go back to as well, because you mentioned this right before we started recording, was kind of those sticky parts of life, and how, let's use social media because it's the easiest target. The reflection isn't as real, and we're seeing something from afar, but we don't hear, of course, all of the behind the scenes adversity. But how you've been using kind of even envy as a tool lately. So we need to go there, but then we need to like get through the motherhood part too, because that's a whole nother next book. And the reason I think this is so important, though, to talk about what you have recently experienced is I sit in the epicenter of a lot of different women and hear a lot. And literally within 1 week, it was actually 72 hours, 3 different women came to me and said, I don't know how so-and-so does it all. Look at what she's doing, da-da-da-da-da. And what they didn't realize is those other 2 people actually had came to me that same and said the same thing, right? So it's like, well, they don't, so don't worry about how you don't know how, because they're not, and there isn't a how. So anyway, it's just comical to think of the chasing a phantom, right? That we think is outside of us. But share what you've been up to lately with kind of hacking social.
Yeah, there was this incredible podcast, and the author being interviewed had written the book 7 Deadly Sins. And it was specifically for women about how we kind of internalize and end up performing in these different ways. And she was using the context of these 7 deadly sins, one particular, envy. And in it, she was describing like envy can actually be a really productive tool if, instead of just basking in envy, realizing that anything that we envy in someone else is really identifying an unmet need in ourselves. And if we're vulnerable enough to really acknowledge that, and instead of kind of shoving down these like emotions that we think like aren't pleasant, that envy and jealousy and anger and all the things that we as women are like, you're not supposed to be any of that, like be sweet, and anyway, so I was just kind of like practicing. I'm one of those people who's like immediately want to apply things to my and a
quick start can be a false start. It's like, let's go now. It's like, oh,
exactly.
Next time.
Exactly. I get really excited, when someone's like, here's a new mantra. And I'm like, I'm going to write it down and say it 15 times a day. So I can get really energetic about that kind of stuff. But it dawned on me that being a new mom and always like being up in the middle of the night while I'm pumping and wanting some kind of distraction, that I would scroll on social media. And there was this one woman in particular who is single, who doesn't have any kids, who is like a banging Victoria's Secret body, who like every time you go to her page, it just looks like she's having so much fun, and she's like in exotic places. And she's a friend of mine. And so I ended up like very vulnerably texting her, of course, at like 3:00 in the morning. And I was like, forgive the late night text. And I shared that I just listened to this podcast, that I realized that like her page is where I would go. And like, historically, I would feel really envious of her life, of her freedom, of all the things that I felt like were missing in my like new mom life. And I said, and what I realized was, rather than simply envy from afar and allow that to make me feel bad about myself and my life, that I actually wanted to thank her for inspiring me, because what I realized was there's a handful of unmet needs that I had, and that these were the action items that I was going to take because I wanted to use her as fuel to inspire me, and not simply as, envy to like take away from my life. And so I said, I'm going to prioritize, getting back into the gym, and I'm prioritizing, doing more fun in my, like, specifically chasing more fun in my life and all these things. Needless to say, it was kind of one of those where I think because I'm sleep deprived, which is basically like, I feel like I'm operating in daily life, basically drunk with no inhibition these days as a sleep deprived mother. But I kind of just like hit send before I let myself think too much about it. Cause I was like, if I think too much about it, I won't send it because it feels deeply vulnerable to like share this with someone. And sure enough, I go back to sleep. I wake up the next day and I had this long text from her that is saying basically the exact same thing mirrored back to me of like, I can't believe that you're sharing this. This is so brave. This is so inspiring. When the truth is, yes, I'm like party a lot and having a good time and all these things, but really like I'm looking at your Instagram being like what I would give to like have a partner, what I would give to like be a mother. Like it was just one of these, like she mirrored with the same vulnerability and was basically saying like all these things, like I want all these things too. And like, what a reminder to all of us that when we are engaging with social media, we're basically comparing our insides to everyone else's outsides. And what a reminder of like the power of sisterhood. Like I felt so deeply seen by her. She felt so deeply seen by me. We were like, let's figure out a time, like come to Montana. Like I want to spend more time with you. And it was just a really beautiful moment again, of just like reframing, especially among women, this very natural paradigm of scarcity with women where we are programmed to be threatened by each other and to be jealous of each other. When I think we can reframe that in a way that's like incredibly productive and actually like creates more intimacy and vulnerability for us. So yeah, that was just like one tiny anecdote, but I'm definitely conscious of that when I'm like posting pictures of Montana and I'm like, it's so amazing. Like this, we're living like the Yellowstone dream. And then I'm like, oh, and by the way, like I, bit my husband's head off this morning because we got no sleep last night. And, so trying to balance the curated highlight reel of social media with sprinkled in reality, because I think it can be a little dangerous how we present our lives to the world, knowing that people are looking at them and comparing them, to the realities of just real life in general.
It is so true. And it's such a monologue, right? Not a dialogue. When we operate that way. And I love this envy. It's like envy equal value exchange. Like you're guiding each other, right? Like, oh, same. So we could be envy mentors to each other, right? Like, I love that. Way to flip that. And I think of a neighbor I have. She's taking time off out of her career to stay home more and spend more time with the kids during the day and so on and so forth. And there are times we go on walks where we're both just envious of each other's lives, and it's a good, healthy, like refreshing feeling of like, I can say that out loud. And, at moments, and I love my life, but it's just a relief to be able to connect at that level. Like, no, this is real. This is true. As we were hopping on, and we're almost at 300 episodes here. Like something was going on with the audio and I'm overprogrammed between meetings today with a little glitch, which isn't typically necessarily the case anymore. So I thought I kind of had that fixed per se. That's laughable. But you could probably see the healthy tension between my husband and I of like, oh, I thought this was set up and ready. And oh, yeah. And so we were going through that and probably not the most kind. But as you find yourself like kind of in a probably different operating system, when you default or slip back into old methods, how do you get yourself, like what are some of your techniques to get back to alignment?
Yeah, great question. And certainly I feel like any parents listening understand like the fog that my husband and I are in because our son is like 4.5 months old. And it's just such an unbelievable like reckoning in your life as far as turning it upside down and new normals everywhere. And Brad and I recently, we really pride ourselves on like trying to communicate kindly to each other. And when we aren't, being able to kind of take a deep breath and be like, whoa, kind of what's going on? And we are like the first to say what huge fans we are of therapy. We both go like individually and together. And like, we started going before we ever got married. And what we realized was about 3 months in, it was just like kind of this like vicious back and forth. And I was like, wow, this is not how we typically communicate with each other. Like, what is going on? And the first thing I said was like, we need more tools. Like I think that's what this means, right? Like, we've more stress in our life. Of course, we've added a tiny human that requires an immense amount of attention and time and effort, energy. I was launching a book. Brad is in the height of his sales season out here. So it was just kind of like everything was kind of elevated and all at the same time. And I just said, I think we need more tools. And we actually ended up hiring this parenting coach. And I love it because Brad, as an ex-pro athlete, it was such an easy sell to get him to do therapy because, you say coaching and he's like, I'm in. Like, he was just like, are you kidding? As a pro athlete, you have like 15 different coaches for all different things.
Feedback loop. Give me more. I want to get better.
Exactly.
They're so coachable.
Like,
yeah.
Great coach and like nutritionist and, all these different things. So it was a really easy sell of like, if we want an 11 marriage, and not all the time, but if that's what we're aspiring to, he was like, of course, we're going to hire a coach to make us like better, faster, stronger. And the same thing when we hired this parenting coach is I was like, listen, man, we're in like an entirely new world. And within 2 sessions, the parenting coach, it was really fascinating. She said, and at the time it felt kind of weird because we were doing it on Zoom, but she was like, here's the deal. Like, we need to rebuild that level of like empathy, and trust and intimacy. Because, with a new baby, you're both so distracted and there's so much more distance between us because just like where our focus was. And she said, I'm going to, step off camera, but I'm going to actually record for 30 seconds. The timer will go off. I want you to give a silent hug for 30 seconds. And it sounded like, honestly, at the time, like a little cheesy. We're like, oh, okay, like I get it. Like hugs are good, And sure enough, she like steps off camera, sets the timer. Brad leans over, kind of like awkwardly, like hugs me. And 30 seconds actually feels a lot longer than it sounds. And before you know it, like the first 10 seconds, it's kind of like obligatory. And the next 10 seconds, you're like, oh God, this feels like nice. And by like the last 10 seconds, you're like, oh, I miss you.
Oh,
like
yeah.
I miss us.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very real like grieving period of like the version of us that existed before our son doesn't exist anymore. And she comes back on camera and she asks us like, how did that feel? And immediately like our entire energy towards each other was really different. And our tone of voice was different. And she said, here's the deal. And she gave some science to it of like what this does to our nervous system, what this does to like reconnect us, what like all these things. I'm a big fan of like inspiration met with like science and data. And she said, here's the deal. I want one or both of you to initiate 3 30-second silent hugs a day, which like, who doesn't have like a minute and a half?
Right.
A day.
However, that sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
To find 3 times, 3 windows. No, that's isn't that a level set though? That's not a long time.
Not a long time. And it's like, when you're in the closet, when you're in the, like kitchen doing things. And what I know, and here's the deal, like we also weren't perfect about it. Like we didn't do like 3 times a day, but even like once or twice a day where one of us would be like, hey, come here. And again, it was like, it felt kind of like cheesy. I'd be like, hey, come here. Like, let's do our 30-second hug. And we kind of giggle about it. But every time it was the same thing. It was like the first 10 seconds felt obligatory. The second 10 seconds was kind of like, oh God, this feels really nice. The last 10 seconds, we could feel our bodies relaxing into each other. And so I'm a big fan of, again, like inspiration met with like, give me tangible things, give me something like actual takeaways that I can like incorporate into my life. And I would say like the 30-second silent hug of like reconnecting has been like monumental shifts. And one of the things that she said was make the small things big things right now. So make that tiny 30-second hug, even if you're doing it once a day, make that the big things, like the things that matter the most. And what I found is that, on the other side of us being in kind of a really highly, like you said, like almost for us, it was like palpable tension in our house. And we didn't snap our fingers and all of a sudden it's like rainbows and sunshine and unicorns over here, but I will say like, that was something that like really reset us every day. So like when we were in the height of frustration, and she even said like in the height of that frustration, that's the real challenge, is like when both of you are really at each other, can one of you be like, hey, take a deep breath. Can we do a 30-second hug? And we can get right back into what we're talking about. But like, let's just connect in this, like and it's unbelievable how much like deep breath, hugging each other, and then like pulling away and being like, where were we? Okay. And again, it's like the science behind like how it reframes your nervous system and all these things. But I think that was like one thing that I'm really realizing is what's kind of referred to as like the sacred pause of like, because we get so wrapped up in life and like urgency and like you said, being overprogrammed, like, gosh, does that resonate with me when you're like one meeting to the next and the next to the next. And for me, I just always felt like I was behind. I always felt like I was late to everything, and being able to take a sacred pause to not simply react, but to like intentionally respond to something. I don't know. It's been a huge game changer for me.
The tactical implementable things are so valuable. And we've been kind of circling each other's friend circles or career, like professional networks, I think for many, many years, but it was a year or two ago, I think pre full commitment to Montana for sure. Cause I remember you visiting, or I wasn't quite sure, but I think people were connecting us because of my NICU experience and what you were navigating with your, not only fertility, but then your hospital long stay experience, as we will call them. And so I know, as friends tend to connect each other, even if they're completely strangers, because it's such a unique journey. And one thing that happened when my son was born 3 months early, we spent 3 months in the NICU after in a different city because I was on a layover, and it's just like, it was so, life went upside down. Richard and I were walking home from the NICU. We got a little apartment across the street one night, and we were at that similar spot, like, hey, like, we have to find a strategy here because this isn't going to work. Like, we need to conserve energy, people, places, things, what can go. And then we made this rule up called the 20-second rule. And it basically was, we're both in rare form and we're saying and doing things because of exhaustion and stress, and our baby's 2 pounds, that we typically wouldn't. So how about if you say something that you want to just bring back and you wish you hadn't, you can say 20-second rule, and the other person has to let it go. And so to this day, as he was leaving because of this audio, like little debacle, I texted, I was like, 20-second rule. So 4 years later, we still got our 20-second rule, but it's just like, hey, acknowledge, I know I shouldn't have done that. I didn't mean it. Can we move on? And it's saved us. I mean, days have probably been saved of not being just like mad at each other. So I love this 30-second hug thing, and I'm going to go tell him about it. But it's the other one is, what does love and support look like for you today? And sometimes it's like this hour, because you might just be, in a moment. Bridger, how's Bridger?
Bridger is awesome. He's like upstairs. We're working on getting him into his crib. And so he's napping right now, which is very exciting. Hence I'm on this interview with you, but he's doing amazing. He's growing like a weed, which, he was born 5 weeks early. So we were in the NICU 2.5, not quite 3 weeks, which I know so intimately. And then he came home on oxygen for another 2.5 weeks. So then we were like living within I think the cords were 7 feet, within like a 7-foot radius of his life. His entire existence was like for almost 3 weeks, was those 7-foot cords. So we called it the war room, and we just like turned our living room into like the room we did every single thing in. And so I mean, those first, it was a ride. It was an unexpected water breaks early, live in the hospital for a couple weeks. Son's in the NICU for a couple weeks, comes on oxygen. And I remember like when we finally, like all the cords were like gone, and we were like, we went from a landline baby to a Wi-Fi baby. Yeah. We were like, what? We can just like pick them up and like walk them into different rooms. And, it was just like, I don't know. I think that because our fertility journey was so long and so hard and so heartbreaking, and I'm like such a hopeless optimist. So I'm always like, what's the silver lining? And I think in learning how to exist, not comfortably, but just learning how to be in the unknown for so long, as you know, with like a long fertility journey, I think that ended up becoming like a superpower for me, that I could sit in a space where I didn't know when, I didn't know how, I didn't know how long. And I think it's part of what equipped me to then be in that 2-year journey of like making Montana home, was that I was so used to like being years of like, we don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know, and I think the whole challenge of what I refer to as his grand entrance into the world,
a big splash,
brought yet another amazing lesson of just being right here, right now. And that being the only moment that exists. And now I look at him and, I'm walking on the street with my little like baby Bjorn, and people have no idea how hard the journey was. And he's just this like happy, healthy, babbling, non-sleeping through the night baby. Now we have like unoriginal complaints of like being deprived. But he's doing awesome. And I think it's only made it, every baby is a miracle. And that, especially on the other side of any kind of infertility journey, what miracles they are. And I think it has only made like our experience with him that much sweeter, because we're like, man, and I'm like, how much money we spent with like IVF and egg donor and all things. I'm like, bro, you are paying for college. Yeah. That was we are not paying for your college. You're getting a scholarship. We paid for you. Yeah, he's awesome.
Oh, that is so cool. And what an awesome story and journey. And this thing, and having written a book, you had a baby, then I look at books as it's like 2 babies. First you write it and you get that thing across the line and you send it, which is a big deal. That's like having a baby. But then you go promote it, right? So it's like you are having multiple babies here at the same time. And I remember seeing on social, I'm like, she's in the hospital right now I know exactly kind of what's going on there, and that's a lot. But I'm excited for everyone to read Joy Hunter. And by the way, amazing title. It's just nice, like I said, when we can look at, people have been tracking you, I'm sure, for years. And this was probably a plot twist that wouldn't have been extrapolated, but it's the perfect one and the most successful version. We need more stories of, now I'm like, maybe it's time to go back to South Dakota or Wyoming.
But here's the deal. I'm like, if anyone hangs out with me long enough, I will convince you to be crazy enough to live your wildest dreams. If I have any superpower at all, like it's Tinkerbell, because like I can sprinkle some fairy dust and convince people they can fly, because I just believe that like the hopes and dreams and passions that we have inside of us, like I do not think that we are imbued with those like just to toy with us. Like I think those are meant to be realized. And I don't think that we need any better excuse than these things bring us joy. I think that is enough excuse. So I'm with you in that I'm like, oh, someone has like a little inkling that they want to move somewhere. They want to try something different. They want to like start a new business. They want to go to a dance class for the first time. I'm like, listen, let me give you a pep talk.
I'm the same. It's like, date it. You can try, I love it. We're wired the same. And I think that's where it's usually safe enough to try, right? When we start to put a logical mind to it as well, but it sometimes isn't as common as you would think. And so thank you for sharing your time and your energy and your brilliant story that's continuing to unfold. And we will keep following your tracks for sure. And it's so good to connect after so long of everyone saying, oh, you need to meet.
Finally.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm so thrilled to have finally gotten to see your beautiful face and to officially meet you. And I'm excited to hang out more.
Likewise. Hey
everyone. Thanks for listening to the show. Hit me up on social media to let me know what you think. I'm at Amy Jo Martin on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I want to hear your Why Not Now moments so I can share them on the show. Just send me a note to whynotnow@amyjomartin.com. For show notes and other offers, you can visit amyjomartin.com/whynotnow. And while you're there, don't forget to sign up for my email newsletter for exclusive content and announcements. A big thanks to Rock Salt Music for all of the tunes by the talented John Coggins. And of course, a hat tip to Richard Brewer for editing and producing the show. I'll see you next time. And until then, why not now?